Hi, welcome. Today on the show, I'm going to be chatting with Dr. Mary MJ McConnor. She's the owner and founder of Inclusive Excellence Consulting. MJ, as she is best known, is a certified diversity executive, CDE, who has worked in the diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and international education sectors for over 14 years. So let's welcome MJ to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, Sandy.
Hi. So I just like to get this out of the way really quickly. I like to tell people how we've met, and we met through the American Heart Association. I actually
Yes.
photographed you. You're one of this year's Women of Impact honorees. And so we just had a fabulous time at the Memphian Hotel. So
Yes.
we hit it off, and I just love you. I love your nickname MJ. I just love it. It's just awesome. So I wanted to tell a little bit about your story, and
Mhm.
uh, also talk to people about being an entrepreneur, being a woman, living in Memphis now. And so, at, interesting enough, you're actually from Detroit, and you're actually
Yes.
in Detroit right now,
Correct.
a city I've never been to, but I would love to go. So
Mhm.
why don't we just start off with you talking about where you are now and what exactly that you do?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I have a consulting firm called Inclusive Excellence Consulting. So I've been doing DEI work for several years, and I actually came from the higher education space. So for years, I worked in higher education. I was a director of multicultural student services, executive director of inclusive excellence, and then moved all the way up to vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, higher ed is in an interesting spot right now when it comes to a lot of DEI work. I don't know if everybody's been keeping up, but I was like, I feel like this would be a good time to do work as a consultant and go off and start an entrepreneurial venture. And I feel like it's the best decision I could have made because I'm like, yeah, I work long hours sometimes, but the freedom to just say, oh, yeah, I can work with this client and I can do this today. And so it's just, I wouldn't change it for the world. I love it.
So now let's talk. You are in Detroit right now. You
I
grew up
am.
in Detroit. So let's talk about what was it like growing up in Detroit, and what do you take from that growing up in Detroit area?
Yes. So here's the thing about Detroit that a lot of people don't realize. It's actually an incredibly diverse city. And a lot of people, when they think of Detroit, because we do have one of the highest African American populations, in the United States, they assume like, oh, it's just mostly Black people. But I mean, when you go to different neighborhoods and different communities, I mean, there's people from all over the world. And part of the reason for that is because we have a lot of automotive factories here.
Right.
So, like General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and those jobs brought people from everywhere, literally all parts of the world. And so, just growing up, I had the opportunity. I would go to Dearborn, Michigan, which is right outside of Detroit, and they have like the best Middle Eastern cuisine. And then I could go to Southwest Detroit, where they have some of the best, you just all types of cuisine and just
Right.
different cultures. And so it's just something that's always been a part of me and that I've always valued. So Detroit is actually, it's really similar to Memphis in a lot of ways, because it has kind of that grit and grind, blue
Right.
collar feel to it. So I'm really glad that I had a chance to grow up and be exposed to so many different people.
You certainly don't have an accent at
Oh,
all. I would never have guessed that you were from Detroit at all.
you know what it is? It's because I've lived all over.
Yeah.
Pardon me, sorry, y'all. But I've lived all over at this point. So I lived in Detroit for a little bit, well, most of my life. And then I lived in Atlanta for a little bit, lived in Arizona, Alabama, Memphis. I think I picked up different accents along the way.
Well, and also I think because my sister lives in Boston, and like
Hmm.
see, just then I went Boston, so I pick up things also from different cities and how people say certain things. So yeah, but you didn't have like I don't even know if you told me you were from Detroit, but when I saw that when I was doing my little research, I was like, I would never have guessed that you were from up north at all. So
Yep,
anyway,
because I've lived in the South, I think, what's that, 10 years? At least 10 years. So,
okay,
yep.
okay. So let's talk about First, I always love to ask people this question. So when you were a little girl, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I laugh because it changed every other week.
That's okay.
At one point, I wanted to be a ballerina. At another point, I wanted to be a medical doctor. But I think what I actually really fell in love with was psychology. And I started learning about psychology in high school. And
Really?
I was a psychology major in college. So I actually wanted to be a psychologist, but ended up going into higher education. But I thought it was just the coolest thing. I would watch shows where, you have someone sitting in the chair telling all of their problems to
That's
some
right.
person
That's
taking notes. And I was like, that seems like a fun job to help people.
for sure. I always like to ask people that question. Surprisingly enough, a lot of people don't remember what they wanted
Mm,
to be when they grew up, which I think in a way is a little sad.
yeah.
But it's I always like to ask that. So how did you I know, and I know that you talk about this, but you have a hearing issue and you are
I do.
dyslexic.
I do.
So let's talk a little bit about that, and kind of when did you first realize one or both, or what was that process when you became aware of that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I'll tell you, the hearing, so that's been pretty much lifelong.
Okay.
And it was my grandmother who kind of figured it out
The
because I
one
would
you're
go,
there with right now?
no, my other grandmother,
Okay, okay.
my mom's mom, because my parents would work. And then I would go to my grandmother's house sometimes and she would call me and call me. And she said to my parents, she's like, well, I don't think she can hear that well. Like something is not all the way, right with her ears. Maybe take her to a doctor and have her ears checked. And lo and behold, I can only hear in one ear. So,
Okay.
um, yeah, there was significant hearing loss in that ear because as a child, I had repeated ear infections over and over in the
Oh,
same ear. And with time, the hearing just significantly declined. So, figured that out pretty young. Here's the thing about the dyslexia part. So, we always kind of had an idea, but I think at the time that there was some concern about, oh, we don't want that stigma attached to her. So if we can get away with not having her formally assessed, we will. So I didn't actually do a formal assessment until I was an adult.
a lot of parents and a lot of kids are like that.
Yes.
Especially back in the day. I think I hoping it's a little bit more different now, but I think yes, especially back then, uh,
Yes.
it was very much like that.
Yep. And I can tell you, I know quite a few people. I have quite a few friends
I do too.
who've been diagnosed later in life. I have a friend who's recently diagnosed as ADHD, and she's in her 40s, and so it's just I think during that time it was just like no, they'll grow out of it, or it's like you don't really grow out of
So,
dyslexia.
one of my best friends, she has dyslexia.
Mhm.
But how did you cope with that going through junior high and high school? Like, how did you adjust?
Yeah, I have always been really good at finding other ways to learn. So now, of course, audiobooks are the norm. You can
Right.
just download Audible and some other different apps. But I think one of the biggest things, even though I knew, I never really felt shame per se. Well, I did. Let me take that back. So I did, but I didn't when it came to confiding in my teachers about it. So, like with my peers and classmates, it
Right.
wasn't something I was shouting and telling everybody about. But with my teachers, I would go to them and say, hey, can I get a little more time? Because sometimes it takes me time to read. And so I think a lot of them kind of figured, and they were very accommodating. And so that's why I,
That's really nice because that's not always the case either.
no,
Not
it's not.
teachers are not always, especially when the child is coming to them and telling them that.
Mhm. Exactly. And my dad, he could attest to it, but I had no formal assessment. And so it would just be primarily in classes like English,
Yeah.
history class, stuff that required a lot of reading where I just needed a little more time to make sure I was reading things and understanding what I was reading.
Okay. So, the hearing loss.
Yes.
I know that you actually have a tattoo
I do.
behind your ear, and let's talk about that.
So, here's the story behind the tattoo. Growing up, I would always have people like, "Oh, which side should I stand on? I know you can only hear in one ear." And I decided when I, got I was like about 22 or 23, I think. I can't remember exactly how old I was. I was like, I'm going to get a tattoo behind the ear that I can hear out of so people know which side to stand on because I got that my entire life. And my dad was like, don't do it. He's like, you're not going to get a job. You shouldn't have visible tattoos. And, nowadays
Sure.
people have tattoos. It's very common. But I had some people tell me, like, oh, don't do that because you might not get employed. But it was the best decision I could have made because it made it inclusive for not just me, but for my colleagues as
Well,
well.
sure, sure.
Yeah, they were like, oh, yeah, we know which side to stand on. We want to make sure we're accommodating you. And it just worked for everyone.
Now, I think that's actually a fantastic idea. So let's talk about this. How you got from Detroit to Memphis
Yes.
because it's not a straight path.
It's not. And as I mentioned, I've lived in a few cities at this point. So started in Detroit and then went to grad school in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is in the like here's Michigan. It's like a so Detroit's over here, Michigan or Mount Pleasant's more in the middle.
Right.
And then from there, after I graduated, I actually moved to Arizona. So I lived in Tucson for a couple of years. I worked at the University of Arizona, then moved to Atlanta to work at Georgia State University, then moved to Auburn to work at Auburn, and then took a job at a university in Memphis. And so that's how I kind of moved around because higher ed is one of those fields you kind of have to make moves if you want to move up. Like you can't become too stagnant because sometimes it's really hard to move up within the organization. So that was my strategy. I was like, okay, I'm going to move around until I find the right position. Yeah.
So obviously, Memphis is your favorite place. I'm just going to say
Oh
that.
yeah,
Obviously,
food,
it is.
barbecue. Oh yeah.
Uh, you were talking about food earlier in Detroit, and I was going to ask you, what is your favorite food in Memphis?
In Memphis,
It's hard. It is
I
hard.
know. There are so many different types of restaurants and good restaurants. Of course, I have to say barbecue just because I didn't grow up eating that much barbecue until I moved to Memphis in the
Right.
South. And I was like, oh, this is good. But even some other Southern cuisines, like I had never had like really good fried green tomatoes until I moved to the South. And
Wow.
grits and shrimp and grits. I had that for the first time when I lived in Auburn. I
I
had
will
never had.
say, I haven't. I know I'm gonna like upset everybody. I haven't really taken a liking to grits, and maybe it's
Oh,
because I just haven't had the right kind. Because my mom never cooked that growing up.
right.
She cooked fried green tomatoes, but never grits. She didn't like them. So
Yeah.
it's. But yeah, you're right. I left Memphis in 2004 and moved to Houston.
Hmm.
And talk about diversity. No,
Yes,
and most people don't even realize that, but it is the most diverse city in the United States.
it is.
And then I moved back to Memphis like 3 years ago, and there's just so much more food here now. Like it's
Yes.
really amazing. And we always had really good food. And I always tell people the uglier the establishment and it may look, dilapidated and everything, the better the food though in
So
some
true.
cases. And like the best chicken fingers I've ever had were I got them at a gas station outside of Tupelo, Mississippi.
Really?
The best chicken fingers I've ever had in my entire life.
Do you remember the name of the gas
No, I
station?
don't. This was
Okay.
because I used to drive. When I would come home, I would drive from Houston to Memphis, and I'd always go
Okay.
through Louisiana and up through Mississippi, and a lot of times I took the back roads, and
Mhm.
so I grew up eating at gas stations. Like that's where my mom and my aunt and I would go and like pick up snacks and stuff to go have a picnic. And so, yeah, the best ones I've ever had. But this was like 20 years ago. But still,
I
uh,
love that though. And I smiled so hard because I agree. There's been a few times I'm like, okay, ooh, hole in the wall, and it's some of the best
it
food I've ever
is
had. You're
nicest
right.
people. Not that the nice restaurants don't have nice people, but there's something about that. You talk about the grit of Memphis. There's something about
Yes.
that hardworking blue collar. Just grew up. Cooking food that to me to me makes me remember my childhood. And when we before we started the episode, you're at your grandmother's house in
Yes.
Detroit, and I think for you and I, it sounds like we both grew up with a lot of family around us. And I
Oh,
think
yes.
traditions, whether you're in the North or the South, the traditions are still about, Sunday dinners and food and just having that family atmosphere around food. And now I am actually starving.
Talking about food is probably not helping, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
So let's talk about a little bit. We've talked about you being from Detroit and now living in Memphis, and you said in some ways it's very similar. But
Mhm.
what are some ways that Detroit and Memphis are different?
Yeah. Detroit and Memphis, because, every city has its own
Yes.
culture. And I would say one of the biggest things with Detroit is, well, this is kind of interesting though. So Detroit has this really strong automotive presence,
Right.
right? That is what we're known for. We're known for we
Yes.
are the motor city. And so I know Blue Oval City though is coming to Memphis. So I'm like, that's gonna kind of change things. Well, it's
I don't think that much though. I
you
really
don't
don't.
think so?
I
Okay.
think because it's so far out and
Yeah.
it's bringing jobs, but it's not bringing like half the city.
Right. That's true. That's a good point.
And I don't think that culture, but go so the automotive industry is what you're saying is the difference.
The automotive industry is really big. Um, I know we both have really strong
Right.
music backgrounds, but it's a different type of music. So, the Motown sound had its own complete, it kind of changed the game in a lot of ways because what Barry Gordy and the Motown Records crew were doing over there, they created this whole new sound. And so we have that legacy and history. Um, like I said, it's a lot happening here in Detroit. It's changing. I went downtown the other day and I'm like, wow, they're building so many different buildings and it's just a beautiful city. And of course, the weather is a lot different from Memphis. It
Oh,
gets
that's
cold, and but like I said, I was surprised by how much Memphis and Detroit actually had in common when I moved to Memphis in terms of just the people and the authenticity.
in some ways, if you talk about that big, which was what in the early 1900s, the big exodus from the South up
Yeah.
north. If you talk about that and all the cultural traits, because the music came from the South up and
Right.
expanded and changed as well. And I think that just like in some small ways, a lot of people from New Orleans back in the 1800s moved to Houston. And so
Mm,
Galveston has such a New Orleans presence about it, which most people wouldn't even think about. So I think that, as people move, I think those cultures go and they change and into something new and different and exciting. And yeah, so I would absolutely love to go to Detroit. Let's
yeah.
let's move now into what propelled you to start your own business. You talked about a
Mm.
little bit about that earlier, but what propelled you into that and what are some of the challenges you faced with that?
Yeah, you know what? I love this question just because entrepreneurship is something that I always aspired to. Like, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur at some point. I just didn't know what that would look like because I felt like I always had an entrepreneurial spirit because I enjoy doing things that are creative and outside of the box. And sometimes that doesn't work in a traditional
Exactly.
9 to 5. Like, they want very structured things like, okay, this is the process. And if you
Stay in your
deviate out,
lane.
stay
Yes.
in your lane, right? And if you go outside of that lane, it's like, oh, okay, she's not doing what we want her to do. So I knew I had it in me. But I think what really did it, just being honest, is because of what's happening in higher education, all of the different attacks on DEI work. I was like, this work is too important to stop. And I know there are universities in certain states where they had to completely get rid of DEI departments. And I was like, yeah, I know. Some states, I won't name them,
Yeah.
but yeah. So just thinking about that and just thinking about the importance of what we do, I was like, I know I can still do this work. I just have to do it in a different capacity. And I was like, well, this is the perfect time for me to to go the entrepreneur route. And it's well, I know they say parenthood is the hardest job you'll ever love, but I almost feel like entrepreneurship is like right up there because there are some days, where I'm like, I have no idea where my next client is coming from. I'm
I
like,
totally
then
agree.
all of a sudden it'll be like, hi, I'm reaching out because I'd love for you to come do a workshop series. And, it's just, there's ebbs and flows, it's ups and downs. And I think one of the things that I didn't do in the beginning, like I had no business plan. I had
Right.
no real understanding of how to operate a business. Like I had always worked for someone else. So
Right.
it was difficult in the beginning, like, oh, I have to file taxes quarterly. I have to do, like there's so much you have to learn. But again, I think it's a great opportunity for you to do something that you really feel passionate about and do it in a way where you're not necessarily you're not as restricted as you would be in the corporate setting.
I, the thing about running a business, it's a lot of people don't understand that. And I was helping a
Right.
friend of mine a couple of years ago, and I'm like, you've got to set up your accounting, and she was like, I don't understand. And I'm like, but you got to do all this.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that people, they focus on the setup and not what they're going to sell,
Yes.
and they never make it because they don't have the product, they don't have the service or something. But then I think for the ones that do succeed, you have to figure it out along the way. Like,
Right.
I don't think anybody can be so prepared for everything. You can read all the books. It's like parenthood. You can read all the
Mhm.
books, but when you have that living, breathing thing in front of you, it's different. And as you're
Yes.
going through the data, I mean, so many things can happen. And, there are days that, like, my printer won't work. And I'm like, oh my gosh, where's my
Right.
IT department kind of thing.
Right, exactly. And I love that you pointed that out because even now, like, yes, I'm technically out of the startup phase, but I'm still learning as I go. And the same is true for all entrepreneurs. I think you
Oh,
could be 20
absolutely.
years in and you're like, oh, I never ran into this situation before. Let me figure out how I handle this. So it's a part of the journey.
It is. And, I have not had a full time 8 to 5 job, 5 days a week in 23 years.
Wow.
In 23 years. And I can't imagine going back into that setting. In
Yes.
the beginning, and then we've kind of talked about this. People always ask me, they call me, they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm working. They're like, oh, you got a job? And I'm like, that's what I'm working on. Um, in the beginning, I didn't know how to really operate without having that structure
Hmm.
of an 8 to 5, 5 day a week job. And now I'm so, as you talked about, used to the freedom of doing, taking whatever, making more money one day versus the next day,
Hmm.
you know? And I don't know if I could go back into a setting of a workplace like that. It's
Yes.
it's just kind of so let's talk about, as a Black woman
Hmm.
in Memphis, um, having your own company. Have you experienced any problems with that, or have there been struggles with that, or have you seen the support, or something, anything like that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest struggles that I had in the beginning was access to capital. And here's the reality for women and Black women in particular. We don't get nearly as much support in terms of funding and like
Right.
startups and seed money and stuff compared to male counterparts, specifically white men.
Right.
So I bootstrapped. I mean, I'm telling you, maxed out credit cards. I was like, I got to do what I got to do out here because I really wanted to get my business up and running. And I was like, this is all I have is my credit cards right now. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges. Um, in terms of finding clients in the Memphis region, so here's the interesting thing. I'm just now getting clients in Memphis. Most of my clients are outside of the state of Tennessee.
Really? Okay.
Yes, and
Yes.
so that was kind of a struggle too. I was trying to, like, work my way into different organizations, like, "Hey, if you ever need a trainer or if you ever want me to come do some workshops, I'm open to it." And I think, Memphis is unique because if you're not from Memphis, it can be like, "Oh, we
Yes,
don't really know
that's true.
you," but
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it kinda trying to get in the door can be hard, but once you're in it, it's like, "Oh, yeah, come back, we want you to do another one." So I have some clients now in Memphis, but I think that was a struggle as well. So, yeah, the biggest one definitely was just the finance and not being able to access capital as a
You know,
Black woman.
and that's something that I don't think the conversation focuses on enough. But
Right,
you're right. It's easier, and I think banks, in some ways, and other institutions, they look at men, and I'm probably going to get hate email or something from this, but they look at the men as having more of a sure thing or something.
right.
I don't even understand that. Um, so this entrepreneurial thing, just last month, I think, you hosted for the first time this virtual summit for women
Yes.
wanting to be entrepreneurs. Let's talk a little bit about that and what kind of propelled you to start that and how did it go?
Yes, so it was a 5-day summit, and of course, Sandy, you were a part of
I
that summit.
was.
Thank you very much. And I'll tell you the inspiration behind it is I've had so many women approach me like, "Hey, I see you're really doing your thing. Can you tell me about this? What about this aspect of it?" Or, just different aspects of entrepreneurship.
Right.
And I just felt inspired to say, "Okay, I want to do something for women who are either thinking about entrepreneurship or in the very early stages." And so we can just get together and have this informative dialogue and talk through different scenarios of, okay, this is how you handle this. This is how
Right.
you do a business plan. And it turned out much bigger than I thought it would. I was grateful if 20 people registered. We had over 120 people register.
That is awesome.
Yeah,
That
from
is
all over the nation.
yes.
So it was really great, and we had people at different phases of their entrepreneurship journey too. It wasn't just people in the startup or early phases. There were some
Right.
people who've been in business for several years. So it was just a great experience, and we're going to do it in person next year
I
in
know. I am
Memphis.
so excited about that. I am so excited about that. Okay, so let's we're gonna wrap this up now. Let's
Mhm.
talk about what advice would you give to young women out there today, but especially young Black women out there
Mm,
today about you know getting out of school and going out into the business world.
yes. Whew.
I know that's such a bit
I
broad.
know because I'm like, oh, I could write a book on this one.
Maybe
Because there's so much we deal with in terms of everything from imposter syndrome to just people not always supporting you. And I'll tell you that was one thing I dealt with too, because you mentioned how folks are like, "Hey, you got a job." Like I deal with that too. They're like, "Are you really making it though? Are you okay?" But I would say just be confident in your abilities and know that all of us are unique for a reason. We all have different skill sets for a reason, and you were put on this earth to do what you do best, and don't let anyone deter you from your path. There may be some folks like, "Oh, you should do this. Oh, don't do that. It's too risky." But if
right,
it's something you're really passionate about, I guarantee you want to give it a try, because if you don't do it and regret it later, that's the worst feeling. So it's better to take the risk and say, "You know what? I'm going to try entrepreneurship or whatever it may be."
right.
And at least, give it your all and put your energy and passion behind that. And you just never know what may come out of it. You might invent some cool invention and
I know,
just
right?
go for it. Just go
Um,
for it.
Something I don't talk a lot about publicly, but my ex and I, we had a company for 3 years in Houston,
Hmm.
and it went out of business after 3 years. We grew way too fast, had no funding, so many issues. But the one thing I can say about that is, as much as I wish that had not happened,
Mm,
it also made my stress threshold much higher. So,
yes.
so now things that probably would have really freaked me out and upset me and stressed me out 20 years ago, I'm just like, that's no big deal. That's nothing. So there is some, failing. There's no failure. You learn
Right.
lessons. You learn how things work and how they don't work. And I think that it's important. I think you're important to Memphis because
Thank you.
I think that, young girls need to see people, women especially, doing amazing things with things that are not perfect.
Hmm.
Life's not perfect. And, I think that and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on here, was because I love your story, but I love your personality. I love what you do. And, I think our personalities in some way are a lot alike. I think we
Yes.
see the good in things and we see the glass half full instead of half
Yes.
empty. Uh,
Yes.
so I'm just thrilled, and I'm looking forward to knowing you better. Any last words before we say goodbye?
The only other thing that I want to say is just I love your energy and I appreciate you for your kind words that you just made. Because I was like, Sandy, I got to invite Sandy to the summit because it's the same. I got the same vibe, and you're very welcoming, and you're just positive, and we need more people like you too. So it's just like, yeah, I feel blessed to know you. So thank you for everything.
Thank you. And just hold on. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and we'll be back next time with another show. Have a great rest of the day.
Well, folks, that's it for today. I just want to say thank you so much for listening in today and for the desire to reach beyond what you think is possible. I would love to connect with each of you on Instagram. So if you would screenshot this podcast and then post it in your stories, and be sure to tag official Sandy Adams so I can give you inspiration right back. And if you're feeling all kinds of inspired today, then go ahead and go on over to iTunes and leave me a 5-star review. There's just no shame in my game, I tell you. I would love to know what most motivated you out of today's conversation. And so until next time, have a fantastic rest of the day.